So should Osama, should we start with perhaps like addressing Hossam's question of if everybody can go around and like just like brainstorm what the contributors are to constructed identities?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think Anna probably has a lot of opinions on this because her artwork specializes on identity and memory as well. So perhaps it'll be interesting to hear her perspective.
That was rather sudden. Thank you, Osama. I can only sort of talk about my own situation, and I think that I like the way in which Paul Gilroy, who's do people know Paul Gilroy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. But Paul Gilroy is a black British cultural theorist, lecturer, etc., etc. And he talked about the hyphenated identity. Mm-hmm. And I quite like that because it allows for continued sort of build up on this. So I think that the way that I see it mainly is around issues of dislocation, and that actually concerns anybody who has had to move from one country to another, or has even chosen to move from one country to another. Clearly, circumstances are going to make a difference to that as well. In my own situation, I find that as I learn new things about my circumstances, that also impacts on my life. And I think that this whole time in isolation, if you want, or more isolation than normal, there's a lot of room to start thinking around those issues. And that's actually has quite an effect. And that's why, in a way, I'm quite pleased to be here. Clearly, what's sort of going on in the world then impacts again on us. And again, it depends on where we are. So I think that it's, for me, it's a sort of developing theme. I think that the fact that Osama refers to my work, what I'm interested in is the notion that the fact that history is not just about the histories that have actually been written in the main by people in power, and in the main the ones that I have actually that I'm actually accessing most of the time is within a white Western world. So my own sort of feeling is that I want to redress that balance. And a lot of my work seems to be about using the term redressing the balance. So I'm interested in narratives of people that come from very different areas of life in London or wherever I find myself when I'm doing a piece of work, and trying in some way to expand their own sort of articulation of themselves, perhaps. I don't know if that, I don't mean that to sound in any way sort of arrogant, but really I'm in a position to give somebody an opportunity to tell a story, and I'm interested in hearing that story, and I'm then in a position to be able to pass that story on to other people. I think that's probably as much as I want to say at the moment. I might sort of enter into other discussions later.
Yes, Lawrence, please. Yeah.
Mute. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Hello. Good evening. Sorry, I was a bit late to it. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Lawrence Jaffe. I'm senior advisor. I believe am I the only senior advisor?
A senior in knowledge, not in age, Lawrence.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so sweet of you. Thank you. Sometimes I think it's geriatric advisor, but anyway, here I am. So yes, and I know Osama because I used to be involved with a group called Arab Jewish Forum. I'm Jewish, not Arab, and Osama's Arab, and was on that. And anyway, I'm very proud of what's developed, especially the series of webinars. My own interest is, I wrote a book about the Middle East peace process back in 1996, talking of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, called maybe. It hasn't developed too far since then, unfortunately. But the point, just to pick up the point that Anna made, quoting Paul Gilroy, was a question of multiple identities. And that's a fascinating topic, and I think it's true universally. But like, for instance, if you're Lebanese, you might be Maronite, you might be Druze, you speak Arabic. Where does Arab identity fit in that pecking order, as it were? I think with everybody, there's a different, almost like a personal, sometimes a national way of describing it. Hossam can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 100 years ago, many Egyptians would say, yes, we speak Arabic, but maybe they would speak of themselves as Egyptian first, Arab later. And then there's a position of Mizrahi Jews, for instance, those many who live in Israel, who sometimes call themselves Arab Jews, or Jews from the Arab land, or sometimes the terms are so politicized, they wouldn't identify as such. So just to throw that out about multiple identities, and Milou herself said she was born in America and her dad is from Jordan. So certainly feels Arab from that point of view, but in a sense, we're all negotiating our inner identities. And that's what I would say. I might just to tail end, I'll just say, how important do you think language is in defining Arab identity? Thank you.
Osama, can I just come in with the hyphenated identity, which is quite different? I think that what Paul Gilroy refers to is not just in terms of your where you've been in your life, or where your parents have been, or where your grandparents have been, but it's also a mix of what you do that actually also integrates itself within that identity. So I'm a visual artist. I've done community work. All of those things impact on my identity. So it's not just based on which countries my forefathers and foremothers came from, and how other people see me. It's also made up of what my life is about. And I think that's a very important point to take into consideration when one thinks about identity. Sorry, that's it, just to clarify.
And Anna, like just adding on your point about hyphenated identity, I mean, this reminds me of Du Bois' double consciousness, where like how Du Bois, African American sociologist, who said that African Americans have that hyphenated identity, right? They have this double consciousness that they have to see themselves as both Africans and Americans constantly, while other races, for example, the white race in that context, would only they don't need to see themselves as European Americans or Irish Americans. They can just be Americans because they're white. And I mean, and the concept of double consciousness, as Anna said, I mean, with the hyphenated identity can expand to refer to identities outside the African American racial and I guess national identity as well. So that's really interesting.
Yes.
Can I
This is
answer
very
that?
interesting. Okay, please go ahead, Layla.
No, doctor, it's okay.
Please, ladies first.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Layla. Talking to you today from Ramallah, Palestine. I'm Palestinian. And identity politics is so interesting. I would like to go further back, from these conversations. I see all the identities which are identified currently are political, because for me, they stem from political structure. For example, if we talk about the Arab nation, if we talk about why are we called Arab, what did unite us in the first place? Was it the language? Was it the nomadic life we lived? Was it the contiguous piece of land which was called Arabia? Was it geography? Was it language? Was it habits? Was it norms? We had these everybody had attributes, because when societies developed, they started developing in groups, and groups started identifying themselves as norms, as things they would do together, something that would unite them. And then came religion, and then came habits, and then came geography, atmosphere, and then everything that identified who the people are. Why did they move from one place to another? What did they do for a living? Why did they do that? For the Arab world, I see that it was completely political after being called Arabs, because when nation states came, when there were states in the first place, especially for the Middle East, we were Levantine. Like, it wasn't before the 19th, start of the 20th century, we were Levantine. We were not Palestinian. We were Palestinian. We were referred to as Palestinians because we lived in the land Palestine, but there was nothing actually that said we are Palestinians per the states or the borders, because everybody was everybody. My grandfather, he had cousins in Lebanon. He was connected to the Upper Galilee in Palestine, and then he came what is called now West Bank. So he was Levantine before he became Palestinian. Palestinian became a political term to identify historical Palestine we talk about, and referring to what Lawrence was saying. And this is part of the confusion when somebody identify as Jew, but not Israeli, Jew, Arab. And it was really interesting. I was in a bus going to Tel Aviv once. I was going for a visa and something, and somebody was talking. I was talking with my friend, and somebody overheard us, and he was talking to us. He was a very nice man. And then he spoke in really Arabic, in a different Arabic language, was more than like Lebanese. And I was so interested. I wanted to know, who is he? What is he doing going to Tel Aviv? And apparently he was a Lebanese Jew who was in Lebanon before in the 70s, and then he moved into Israel to live there. And the question that came to my mind, what made him go to Israel for being that, was what drove him to his religious identity rather than his nationalistic, for example. And this is how politics played a role. So for me, it goes back beyond these identifications where identity became politics, and then it was used for politics, and this is how it becomes. So for me, I would identify as an indigenous kind of people who are fighting for the right to be on my land. And for me, it doesn't matter if I'm Jewish, Christian, or Muslims, because there were Jewish from like hundreds of years who are living in Palestine. For me, these are Palestinians because they live on the land, they belong to the land, and they own their houses and their lives, etc., etc. So it's not about that in general. So in a sense, sometimes I would like to break down these identities and not go by the political identification of such identities, and then to break them down. For example, some Christians in Palestine would relate to European or to the Pope more than they would relate to being Palestinian, and vice versa. So why would that happen? And then I would think it's the personal attributes where somebody identify, or like Shada said at the start, is how we were brought up to be like this. Like I didn't choose to be this, but I was born this way, and then I adopted it because this is how I was indoctrinated, or this is how I was taught. So for me, it's all about the politics of the place and how you identify with reality and your personal attributes. Like I am born Christian, but then I would become Christian by choice, or I would say that's not the thing for me. So for me, it's the initial struggle of, shall I admit to the politics of the identity I was given, or shall I analyze it or break it down further? Because it is a complex. We're not just one thing. We're human beings with all these attributes, social, spiritual, let me say, not even religious, mental. I could relate to, I don't know, a music band in Thailand because they identify with what I want to hear or what I want to read, etc., etc. Like I love Japanese novel. What does make the connection, or art, etc. In the case of Anna and everybody else. So for me, it's the breakdown of these attributes into something that's related to me, and trying to break down the politics of what was imposed on us at some point.
I think one of the points you made that really was very interesting for me was the fact that many Christians in the Arab world identify with Europe on the basis of their Christianity. And I think it's interesting that the Judeo-Christian identity is closer to European identity than a Muslim one. Arguably anyway. I know that every identity is subjective, but many people would have that opinion. And I think the reason I find this dynamic interesting, not only is it because Christianity and Judaism also started in the Middle East, and the origins are the same as the Muslim identity, but perhaps this was a move that was catalyzed by the Roman Empire and the association of Christianity with Europe. So I want to explore what, obviously, Jonathan Fryer perhaps has a few insights on this as a lecturer. Do you teach identity modules in your course at SOAS, for example?
Absolutely, yes. Identity is a totally core issue of the sociology module of humanities. And we see it in terms of individual identities and collective identities. listening with great interest to much of the discussion so far on collective identities. Perhaps I'd like also to throw in a different perspective, in the sense that one can see identity also as layers of an onion, not just matters of hyphens, but different layers, and you show different layers according to the context in which you are.
And do you think that there are more layers or more complications with identity? For example, I know the topic is about Arabs in the Arab world and their identity politics, but do you think Arab diaspora or Arab migrants in the West have more layers by birth circumstance, in your point of view?
Possibly it would depend on the case. I mean, obviously, you know, there are Arab British or Arab Americans, for example, but within the Arab world itself, I think we have to acknowledge that the Arab world is far more multicultural than we sometimes assume. And particularly amongst Westerners, there's often this gross assumption that the Arab world is entirely made up of Muslims and all Arab, pure Arabs, whereas we know that's not the case. And even with Islam, there are many different types. And it's interesting, we've got a couple of people with a Kurdish connection, because obviously they're an area that I've done a lot of work on. I wrote a book about Iraqi Kurdistan. There is a real interesting challenge for people, positive in many cases, as in Iraqi Kurdistan, but deeply problematic in some other parts of the Arab world, including in Syria.
Yeah.
If I may add on that, Jonathan, I agree, and that's why I always I don't like to say the Arab identity, but more identities in the Arab world, and for that exact reason. For example, in Libya, I did my research on the discourse of identity in the discourse of political identity in the context of Libya during the uprising of 2011, and I was surprised to learn that in the south, so like the Tuareg and the Tabu, which are other ethnicities that are not Arab nor Amazighi, they call them nomads, which I find that term quite problematic. So like the Tuareg and the Tabu, because of political project, at some part of history, the Gaddafi regime chose to give them national identities, so not an actual citizenship. So by that, they became Libyans, by the paradigm of the nation state, if that's how we're going to frame identity. And then in the other groups were not given that citizenship card that says they are Libyan. So from that framework, they don't have a citizenship. And so if they don't have a citizenship, what does that say about that layered identity? What do they refer to? So Libya as an Arab state of 4 ethnicities, it's still considered an Arab state with, I mean, we're like 4 ethnicities, and that's never even talked about. So I agree with what you said, and I think that's there's political reasons to why we choose to talk about the nation state as a frame of identity. And to add on that, like especially with the Kurdish case, Sykes-Picot decided to just divide the entire region so that we became these little nations that now we identify with these little nations, and now we fight amongst ourselves about these nations, when it's just literally a French and a British man came together and looked at the map and said boom boom, Sykes-Picot, and now we have nation states. So
however, may I jump on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
In Libya and North Africa. So, and speaking of imperialism in general and how it identified identity for that region that was continuously throughout the history colonized by different imperialisms, and it took them hundreds of years to rewrite the identity of the region. So in Libya, for instance, when before the Greek and the pharaohs, there was a Libyan, native Libyan empire. And then the pharaohs came, and after hundreds of years, Libyans, the native Libyans, became associated with the pharaohs as pharaoh leaders, and became pharaoh leaders and became part of that imperialism. And the same with the Greek, the same with Roman, and the same with the Islamic Empire, which the Arab used as part of their spread. So when the Muslim empire was spreading all over the region, Arabs and others were migrating and changing location. Now, fast forward all the way to after dividing the lands and deciding that this is called Libya. When Libya was founded, it was called the Nation of Libya. It wasn't called the Nation of Arab Libya. There wasn't such a thing. When they made a race, they ran a race. When they gathered the race data, they had Arabs and then non-Arabs who became Arabs, and then the Amazigh and Tabu, Tuareg, and the other races. Now, let's stop at the non-Arabs who became Arabs. Now, that's where everything changed moving forward when Gaddafi's regime came, because he said there is no non-Arabs who are Arabs. There is no other ethnicities. It's just Arabs, and we are part of the Arab nation. We're not the Libyan nation. So I just wanted to share that, and I wonder if that's the case in the rest of the region.
Sure, Saman, did you wanted to say something on this point?
Hello again. Yeah, so actually I'm a Kurd, and I would like to share my understanding of the debate. As a Kurd, after as Ms. Shada just mentioned, after Sykes-Picot, even the nation we live with, and even the international community, they didn't recognize our, let's say, nationality, our rights, and we get struggle until in a southern Kurdistan. I mean, in Iraq now, after 1991, and uprising, we have a governor, and we share with the new Iraqi after regime 2003, and in KRG nowadays we have a multi-identity. I mean they live with us, Arab, Turkoman, and yeah, some Jewish. But actually we have community security, and each nation they share and they express in a freely, and their language and their habit and their what they believe accept. We have kind of peace and tolerance between all who live in KRG. But actually, I would like to say, and I will appear a question, which is, can anybody try to answer the threats to the national identity, okay, in even today or in a upcoming decade, let's say, and how we gonna to promote our national identity based in the, let's say, the understanding and non-military act, okay? So isn't gonna be okay if we promote our, let's say, the method or tools that help us to promote the, let's say, to keep our national identity safe? Isn't civil engagement, cultural dialogue, and building inclusive institution? Yeah. I'm here to answer if there is any question. Here my whole point. Thank you for time.
Thank you very much. I think you raised a couple of points were raised that were very interesting about by yourself and by Loué, about the extent to which Arab identity is socialized and is the result of imperialism. And I think this is it's a sensitive topic, but I think it's important to have it because whilst I agree with Sherda that a lot of our identity conflicts are the result of post-colonial dynamics in the Middle East and the division of the area, I still think that we are, and well, I say we, Arab leaders are to an extent still responsible for managing their instabilities appropriately to not allow these identity conflicts to get out of control. Yeah.
So when you say Arab leaders, who's that?
Yeah.
Well, they haven't changed much. Like there's
Yeah.
25 people since forever.
So are we talking government leaders?
Yes.
Are we talking? Okay.
Yes, because you can't have all the right, especially if you're undemocratically elected, you can't assume all the rights and all the fruits and benefits of being a leader without having the responsibility to unpick some of these very complicated situations. I still think, even though a lot of us may not view these leaders as legitimate, I still think that we should hold them to account in terms of how they manage situations. I guess a good example is, again, it's a controversial one, but it's the Iraq War. Of course, the intervention of Britain and of America was not good. It shouldn't have happened. It was on a false premise and it destabilized the region. At the same time, I do also believe that Saddam Hussein, through his own identity politics, through his oppression of the Kurds, and so forth, he played right into the hands of America to fabricate stories and to intervene on a false basis. So he was also a diplomatic failure, in my opinion. As much as we do blame America, we still need to look at the way we manage our circumstances as well. That's my. I'm not sure if anyone, perhaps Nick does a lot of research on this. If he has an opinion on this, for example.
Osama, I feel I'm sort of scraping the surface of this very, very interesting discussion. Actually, Osama, I mean, I don't think I can offer anything very helpful. I feel as somebody who's sort of not part of the Arab world, I actually feel I'm hearing some incredibly interesting things, but I'm not quite sure how to respond to them right now as a Jew and someone with lots of skepticism about, identity politics as a concept even. As a sort of Marxist, I wonder whether identity can be used to divide people rather than, find unity between oppressed classes.
Very interesting.
That's just a passing thought at this point.
So may I jump in?
Yeah.
So here's the thing: when we say Arab, who are we talking about? Because if we may, it's not the Arab world. It's not the Arab land. We know where the Arab land is geographically and historically. It's in my view, how we can preserve the identity geographically of these places, and coming from a place like Libya, and the unfairness and injustice that the Amazigh and Tabu and Tuareg and non-Arabs went throughout the history, and especially in the last period of time. It's either that we call it Arab world in that area where it is the Arab world, and then that area, that region of North Africa is just North Africa, and then Mediterranean is just Mediterranean, and Libya itself is just Libya itself. It doesn't matter who or what are the components. The components are here in this piece of land, and we gotta identify ourselves and help each other dig and search our history and present the identity of our ancestors, because this land was deprived from expressing its own identity, coming from various places and various ethnicity.
And that's interesting, because there's the concept of, I don't know if you guys know about it, but the concept of territorialization in relation to identity. So re-territorization and de-territorization, and that often happens as people move. And a lot of times when we look at our identities as it relates to land or territory, there seems to be the need of preserving that identity as it relates to the land. And then if we're trying to figure out identity in the sense of our ancestors, then really is it an individual responsibility to dig into the ancestry and find out who, for example, who do I identify with? Who am I based on, should I define who am I based on the land, the territory that I was born in, the territory that I live in, or the territory of my family and the history of my family, or the ancestors? Because I think these are different questions. And the following question on that is, do we need to? Do we need to do that?
This relates to my question I wanted to ask Shada, actually, and to what Jonathan was saying about collective memory. It's the collective memory of the groups. It's the collective memory of communities. It's the collective memory of religion. And if you go, I cannot remember the writer who was talking about how identity came about and how religion even came about. It's the collective identity of people, and then how nation states came. They became part of the political cycle of empires, of invasions, of imperialism, which then was conducted into borders, let's say. And the question comes in here is whether we need to conform to that or not. So going to what I was saying about Arabs, does the Arab world define everybody in the Arab world or not? Or was it a political one to dominate this piece of land? And the other question, shall we separate on this basis or not? So the question is now, there's a huge trend in the world is accepting everybody, diversity, but what does diversity mean in that sense? Does it mean that Palestine needs to have everybody in it? Does it mean that Libya has a place where everybody, Arabs and non-Arabs, nomads, Amazigh, whatever there was, is there in that collective sense? Or shall we ask, like what's going on in Spain, being part of the Mediterranean, where Catalans want to separate? Are we saying that each group needs to separate from each other because they have a distinct identity, or shall a form of state include them? And does it have to be the same identity, like political identification of that identity or state? So, for example, with the Iraqi and the Kurds and I would disagree with Osama, because eventually the Arab world must have collapsed, either with the outsiders or not. They didn't have the right at any time to go in. They went there for their own interest. But the question is, if they waited a bit more, would the people stay the same? If we waited until Saddam died on his own, I don't know how would that happen, but still, even Mubarak in Egypt, even in Palestine, even in Jordan, and talking about all the Arab countries, if it would happen. So the question is, would we keep the Arab states as they are now? What do we need to change? Does it mean we would love to separate? I mean, is it Iraq without the Kurds inside it? I don't know. It's a question to everybody. And is it the same? Do we need to separate to identify ourselves, or do we need that kind of capsule, if it's called a state or a nation, and it's like that kind of layers of the onion that Jonathan was speaking about? Do I have to be an onion, or do I want to peel and I just want one layer of that and I don't want the others? And I hope this makes sense.
Oz, could I jump in here?
Sure, yes, Sean. Just one thing. I think there was a question from Sama. So if we can get that, and also I wanted to bring Saya in, and then please ask your question afterwards. So apologies, Sean, apologies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's no question actually. It's a comment. It's a comment or answer of the question that do we need to identify ourselves, and returning back to someone's question about our national identity, do we need to keep our national identity? I think, in my opinion, I think there is nothing there is nothing called like our national identity and we have to keep it, and we have to save it, because I think the identity concept is something like we can't control, and I think people are free. So if you go and say we need to keep our national identity, we need to save this, we need to force that, we need to force to not do that, so I think something will go wrong by forcing and controlling. So if people are free, you will see things nourishing, you will see it going to positive direction. And I think if the one wants to explore their identity and dig, it's individual thing. I think everyone in this life is going in his life trying to find out, trying to explore, trying to develop themselves. So I think already they will go and see and dig about their history, ancestors, and also like I think the identity also changing. For example, when I was in Sudan, because of the society and because of the government policy, in my mind I had thinking about my identity, and when I came here I had time to sit with myself, I had time to mix with people, and I found common things with people that I wouldn't find when I was in Sudan. So it's changing and it's accumulating over time.
It's just before Saya comes in. It's interesting that you believe that we can't control identity, whereas Anna believes that our actions and our lifestyle and activities contribute to identity, which we partially control. So I'm already seeing like a diversity in opinion on this, which is really fascinating.